Today, we're going to look at the Renaissance. So the Renaissance really happens because what we see in Italy is a new type of middle class. As fortunes of merchants, bankers, and tradespeople improved, they had more than enough money to meet their basic needs for food, clothing, and shelter. And so they began to desire larger, more luxurious homes, and in those homes, they wanted fine art. They wanted sumptuous clothing to show off to their friends and how much wealth they had in public. And they wanted interesting and exotic delicacies to eat. These desires of the middle class stimulated the entire Italian economy. We also have the new explorers. Some men were drawn to the seas out of curiosity to discover more about the world. One man was Prince Henry of Portugal, known as Prince Henry the Navigator. With the help of mathematicians, astronomers, cartographers, and other navigators, Prince Henry sent expeditions to explore the west coast of Africa. These explorations led to trade for gold and ivory and other things. Later, Portuguese sailors discovered the route around the southern tip of Africa that would take them to India entirely by sea. The other very important innovation that happened during the Renaissance was printing. When Gutenberg invented the printing press in 1445, he forever changed the lives of people in Europe and eventually all over the world. Previously, bookmaking entailed copying all the words and illustrations by hand, as we have spoken about before with scribes. Often the copying had been done onto parchment, which was an animal skin that had been scraped until it was clean, smooth, and thin. The labor that went into creating each and every book was extremely expensive. Because Gutenberg's press could produce books quickly and with relatively little effort in comparison, bookmaking became less expensive, allowing more people to buy reading material. And so what we see is that with this new wealth of the middle class, we also have an increase in literacy. And then there was the new thinking. The new interest in secular life led to beliefs about education and society that came all the way back from the Greeks and the Romans. The secular humanist idea held that the church should not rule civic matters, but should guide only spiritual matters. The church disdained the accumulation of wealth and worldly goods, supported a strong but limited education, and believed that moral and ethical behavior was dictated only by Scripture. Humanists, however, on the other hand, believed that wealth enabled them to do fine things and to do good deeds, and that they could become good citizens, and that if you were going to become a good citizen, you needed to have a good, well-rounded education, just like the Greeks and the Romans had advocated all those years ago. And that moral and ethical issues were related to more secular society than to spiritual concerns. And then there was the new math. The recovery of ancient manuscripts showed the humanists how the Greeks and the Romans employed mathematics to give structure to their art. The relationship between these two studies is most evident in architecture, where numerical ratios were used in building design. A ratio is nothing more than a relationship between two quantities. For example, a building that is 100 feet wide and 50 feet tall has a ratio between its width and height of 2 to 1. The new math, one of the most interesting proportions used by artists in the Renaissance, was the golden mean. This had also been used by the ancient Greeks in art and in architecture. Often found in nature in the shape of a leaf or the spiral of a shell, the golden mean is thought to add harmonious composition to buildings and to other structures. The humanists also used the writings of Vitruvius, a Roman architect, to guide them in their architectural designs. Vitruvius extolled the virtues of proportion and symmetry in architecture, and he explained how the human body represented the beauty of proportions in nature. And there was also a new type of architecture. In constructing churches, Renaissance architects no longer used the shape of a cross as the basis for all of their structures. Instead, they based them on the circle, believing that ancient mathematicians equated circles with geometric perfection. Architects used the circle to represent the perfection of God, the beginning and the end. In constructing their homes, wealthy people of the Renaissance often adopted a Roman style of building the four sides of their home around a courtyard. Simple symmetrical decorations, imitations of classical ones, were applied to the facades of these buildings, and some structures also featured columns reminiscent of all of the ancient temples. And then there was new painting. Paintings demonstrated the application of all of the humanist ideals learned from the ancients. In the works of the Middle Ages, saints and biblical figures are arranged in unnatural geometric groups, and backgrounds are often washed with gold. So we don't really see them as being anywhere, down to earth. The Renaissance painter depicted the human figure as realistically as possible, similar to the way the Greeks were looking for this idea of realism, often with backgrounds of the natural world. Science led to linear perspective. That is how to represent objects in relative size so that smaller objects appear to be farther away from the viewer and larger objects appear to be close up. Careful use of light and shadow, called chiaroscuro, made figures appear full and real. Renaissance painters not only portrayed objects with more realism than earlier artists did, but they often filled their canvases with more objects, all carefully and accurately depicted. This is a painting by Sandro Botticelli, and it is called the Primavera. And there was also a new music. Since the Middle Ages, music theorists had been studying proportions in music, a subject that the Greek mathematician Pythagoras had written about when discussing music. The theorists explained how to make different pitches or sounds on stringed instruments by lengthening or shortening the strings by different proportions. For example, if a musician were to divide strings in half, the proportion would be 2:1. He would create a new tone that is an octave above the original tone. Renaissance musicians carried on this idea in most of their music. In 1336, Pisano completed 2 doors of the 14th, he was an architect, of the 14 bronze panels each. These panels depicted the narrative of St. John the Baptist so beautifully that the doors remained at the main entrance of the baptistry for the remainder of the 14th century. In 1401, the Guild decided to have another pair of doors built to adorn the baptistry. As Pisano had long since passed away, and the art of the bronze casting was still not widely practiced, they decided to hold a competition to get the very best bronze artists they could find. The prize would be both financial and prestigious, as the winner's doors would replace Pisano's beautiful doors at the main entrance to the baptistry. Though Pisano's doors were moved to a less significant entrance, their beauty was never forgotten. Pisano's doors were to be the model for the competition. Contestants were to submit a single panel depicting the narrative of the sacrifice of Isaac. So this is the work of Filippo Brunelleschi. So Florentine architect and sculptor Brunelleschi, he was one of the most famous of all architects, a Florentine hero on account of the celebrated dome 1420 to 1436 that he had built for the city's cathedral. He also was trained as a goldsmith and was one of the artists defeated by another goldsmith sculptor, Lorenzo Ghiberti, in this competition for the new baptistry doors for the Florence Cathedral. Panels depict the sacrifice of Isaac. They both have great artistic and historical importance, and they are the famous trial pieces presented for the competition to the Guild to construct the new door of the baptistry. The lyrical elegance of Ghiberti's version undoubtedly expresses more coherently the famous Bible episode, and Ghiberti won the competition. Like the southern door by Andrea Pisano, this is also divided into 28 panels depicting stories from the life of the Christ and the doctors of the church. Above the door, St. John is preaching by Rusticii, a pupil of Leonardo. The theme of Ghiberti's north doors of the baptistry is the life of Christ in 20 scenes, with the 8 lower panels containing the evangelists and fathers of the church. As these doors were kept shut except on feast days, the scenes read from the bottom across both wings. In 1403, Pilate washing his hands. This is one of the 20 scenes from the life of Christ. This is the Last Supper scene. This is also one of the 20 scenes. And in 1418, when the construction of the Florence's cathedral apse had been almost completed, a competition was announced for the erection of the dome. It was won among criticism and some confusion by the person who did not win the baptistry door competition. That was Filippo Brunelleschi. He erected his revolutionary structure between 1420 and 1436, first adding to the beauty of the church's proportion by constructing a tambour 15 meters high at the base of an ovoid-shaped dome, which was designed in such a way as to avoid the need for reinforcement or scaffolding. The dome has double walls between the inside wall and the roof outside, and there are stairs that ascend to the lantern at the top. The dome is approximately 113 meters high, including the lantern, and has a diameter of 44 meters. This is another architectural piece of Brunelleschi. This is the Foundling Hospital, built between 1419 and 1424 in Florence. This was the first hospital for foundling children in the world, and it was built at the expense of Brunelleschi's own guild, the Guild of Silk Merchants and Goldsmiths. From the point of view of architecture, the important part of this building is the outside loggia. So this is this walkway that has kind of it almost appears like a barrel vault, but it's just individual arches that go across and then creates some shade. Since the hospital itself was completed by Brunelleschi's followers in 1425, he was far too busy with the dome of the cathedral to attend anything else. The loggia consists of a series of round arches with a horizontal element above them and a vault consisting of small domes carried on the columns of the loggia and on corbels and on the surface of the hospital wall. The revival of the rebirth of culture and civic awareness and learning was taking place during this 14th and 15th centuries in Italy. And as we know, we call this the very early Renaissance. It is important to remember that it was also occurring in Germany and other European countries as well. The Virgin and Child, this is a relief by Donatello. And they're often expressions of the tragic in which the premonition of the passion outweighs the tenderness of the subject. Here we look at the profile of the Virgin with her long neck and of the Child who turns away from her, stand out from the background drapery, which works with the chair in the foreground to produce an illusion of depth. Donatello was the kind of veritable embodiment of the Renaissance discovery and invention period. And, we can look at most of his sculptures and statues, and how deep the reliefs are and, just sort of the vigor that he used when he actually chiseled them. So they're really pretty amazing. Here's another of Donatello's pieces, and again, a different version of the Mother and Child. And now we notice that the Christ child, actually looks like a baby. Now that was something that was not done during the Middle Ages or in the Gothic Church. What we saw was these kind of, image of the Christ child as being like a little old man, because there was no way that they could believe that God could ever have been an infant, because they believed that infants were born with nothing, like they were like a blank slate with empty clay, and they had to be molded into something in order to become a full human being. So it was impossible for them to understand that God could be an infant, because then that would mean that God was not all-knowing. So all the images that were of God as an infant are portrayed as kind of like this really unusual kind of old man in a baby form. But by the time we get to the Renaissance, we start to look at a different way of infants, and we can almost say that might be the beginnings of this idea of spiritualism, in terms of children are born full, that they aren't blank pieces of clay. So that term that you'll hear is tabula rasa, meaning empty slate. So really quite beautiful. Here's another piece by Donatello. This is the David. Notice that he is kind of got the head of Goliath there at the base of his feet. Gothic quality, though tempered by a moral intensity and a fierce spiritual pride. This marble of David of 1409, along with the Isaiah of Nani de Banco, the statue, should have been placed in the lower frieze of one of the buttresses of the Tribuna Cathedral. This David proved too small for its intended site, though, and in 1416 it was moved to the Sala del Oriolo in Palazzo Vecchio. It was transferred to the Bargello in the last century. So that's one of his Davids. Now he does multiple versions of the David. So here's another. This one is from 1430. Here we have a very kind of elegant handling of the sculpture of David, but it's almost as if he's in, when we go back to Praxiteles' idea of form, when we saw the Hermes, right? Praxiteles and Hermes statue. Donatello is turned to antiquity now for the representation of a nude and for the static balance of its composition, for the vitality here which animates the statue, from the thoughtful youthful face shaded by a winged helmet to the severed head of the Goliath, is entirely new. The light activates lines which dart around extremely fluid throughout the figure. And Vasari actually described this sculpture, and he says, in the courtyard in the palace of Signoria stands a bronze statue of David, a nude figure, life-size, having cut off the head of Goliath. David is raising his foot and placing it on him, and he has his sword in his right hand. Vasari continues, this figure is so natural and the softness that artists find it hardly impossible to believe that it was not molded on the living form. It once stood in the courtyard of the house of the de Medici, but was moved to its new position after Cosmo's exile. So, keep this figure in mind, because later on we're going to look at Michelangelo's figure of the David, and we're going to really see the difference between this kind of early look of Donatello style and then, how the sculpture changes when Michelangelo does the David. So this is a presentation in the temple. This is a fresco at the convent of San Marco, Florence, and it is by Fra Angelico. So Pietro Fra Angelico was a Florentine painter as well as a Dominican friar. Although in popular tradition he has been seen as not an artist properly so called, but an inspired saint. That was from John Ruskin. Angelico was, in fact, a highly professional artist who was in touch with the most advanced developments in contemporary Florentine art. And what that means is like there were different materials and different things. Like you didn't go to the paint store and just buy paint out of the tube. You had to mix up your different pigments and put different binders in them, and then work with the idea of fresco. In the YouTube section of this part of the course, I'm going to have a YouTube in there on how frescoes are actually made, and I think it'll be quite enlightening for you. Fra Angelico began his career as a manuscript illuminator, and his early paintings are strongly influenced by International Gothic. His most famous works were at San Marco in Florence, now an Angelico museum. a Sylvestrine monastery, which was taken over by the order in 1436. And here we see this is called Noli Me Tangere. Another artist I'd like to talk about is the Florentine painter Uccello. Paolo Uccello was obsessed with this new form of looking at work called perspective. It was called linear perspective, and there were ways that you could sit down and try and figure out exactly the shape of something by using this method. So this is an urn that he draws out, and if you look at it, it really feels like as if this was made on a computer. But he did this all by hand, figuring out every, bit of where each line would go before you would paint it. So Uccello's most significant contribution is his cycle of Noah for Santa Maria Novella. According to Vasari, he represented the dead, the tempest, the fury of the winds, and the terror of man. Vasari primarily praised his portrayal of God the Father, who appears above the sacrifice being offered by Noah and his sons, and of all the human figures Paolo painted. This one must have been the most difficult, for it is flying toward the wall with its head foreshortened, and it is so forceful that it appears to be in relief and to be bursting through it. The scenes below are the flood and the water subsiding, depicting Noah's sacrifice and his drunkenness, and are today in extremely bad condition. But they have been they are also equally beautiful. Here too, Uccello displayed the mastery and the art of perspective. So here's another one of his pieces. This is Niccolo di Tolentino. Basically leads the Florentine troops. And so what he does here is, if we look at these spears that are on the ground, they're all kind of pointing to this idea of perspective, right? Linear perspective. And so they're all going towards a vanishing point. And then in the back, we don't have perspective. We kind of have a hill that sort of goes straight up. So much more of the old style or international style of painting. But we have this perspective in the foreground of the painting as part of the battle. And then we see as the soldiers get smaller and smaller. The battle scene is interpreted in terms of a chaotic melee of horsemen, lances, and horses in a desperate struggle, portrayed through the endless series of superimposed and intersecting perspective planes. This is Bernardino della Ciardo thrown off his horse. Again, very similar, where we have these kind of straight up, the background the hill goes straight up, but that foreground and the ground in the central panel of these three paintings represents the Battle of Florence against Siena. And we can see, again, this idea of using perspective. It's underpainted with a lot of unreal colors and light, and then there's the overpainting, which really makes it feel so kind of like the sun is setting. It's got this really interesting color. And here's another in the series. The next painting I want to talk about is Masaccio. Masaccio, originally named Tommaso Casai, was born in San Giovanni Valdarno near Florence in 1401. He joined the Painters Guild in Florence in 1422. His remarkable individual style owed little to other painters, except possibly the great 14th century master Giotto. This is the most famous work of Masaccio, besides the frescoes in the Cappella Brancacci. There are various opinions as to exactly when the fresco was painted, but they think it's sometime between 1425 and 1428. And there you can kind of see the situation which is painted. So see how the ceiling that has that barrel vault with the coffered ceiling feels like it's going back in space, and there's God, the Father, kind of looking down on his son Jesus as he's been hung on the cross. And the cross feels almost as if it's in the center of this space. So imagine being a Renaissance person and walking into this and seeing this three-dimensional looking design. You know, how incredible that would be. It would be like the first time you walked into an immersion exhibit or something. You know, it would be, there just wasn't that much painting going on. It's described in detail by Vasari, who emphasized the trompe l'oeil. So trompe l'oeil literally means the architectural structure of the painting. So there's all these pieces that look like architecture, and they're not. They're just painted on. So it's like, you know, trompe or fool the eye, right? And divided into squares with rosettes, which diminish and are foreshortened. So it really feels like there's a hole in the wall, and there's not. It's just, here we can see the, if we break the painting down and, you know, a little bit about some of the perspective lines that he was using. So down at the bottom would be the vanishing point, right? And then the other intersecting points. That was how he was able to find where all of those pieces went. Here's Masaccio's Tribute Money. This is a very interesting painting. It depicts the arrival in Capernaum of Jesus and the apostles based on the account given in Matthew's Gospel. Masaccio has included 3 different moments of the story in the same scene. Peter catching the fish in Lake Gennesaret, extracting the coin, is shown in the left. There he is, like on the left-hand side. And then the tax collector request, with Jesus immediately responding, indicating to Peter how to find the money necessary to illustrate in the center. And then to the right, Peter hands the tribute money to the tax collector in the front of his house. So again, you know, something we haven't seen before in one painting was this like same person over and over again in time. The Italian Renaissance artists became anatomists by necessity, as they attempted to refine a more lifelike sculptural portrayal of the human figure. Now, don't forget that they are in Rome, and they are surrounded by antiquity. So they want to paint this way too. So until about 1500, 1510, their investigations surpassed much of the knowledge of anatomy that was taught at the universities. It was illegal at this time to do human dissection. And yet we know that Michelangelo and Da Vinci, as well as probably other artists, did human dissections regularly so they could understand the muscles and the bones and so forth. In fact, Da Vinci, I believe, had a glass heart that was made to his specifications from studying hearts, and that same glass heart was actually referenced in an article on heart disease in a Lancet magazine just this last year. So here we are over 500 years later, and medical scientists are still looking at Da Vinci's designs and Da Vinci's replications. And so I you can't help but wonder how much he had actually advanced medicine because of his courage to do the dissections and really start to think of the human form as a understand it, to be able to replicate it and draw it and have it there for future doctors to study. So opportunities for direct anatomical dissection were completely restricted during the Renaissance. George Vasari's Lives of the Artists states that the great Florentine sculptor, printer, and printmaker Antonio Palladio was the first master of the skin, and in order to investigate the muscles and understand the nude in more modern ways. So here we have some drawing, or an etching rather, of The Battle of Naked Men by Palladio. Giving credence to Vasari's claims, his work was highly influential, and his engravings displayed many figures of nude warriors. They were with nearly flayed musculature, and they're very fierce action poses and different angles. The later innovators in the field, Da Vinci and Michelangelo, are known to have undertaken detailed anatomical dissections at various points in their long career and set a totally new standard for the portrayals of the human figure because of it. This is the Primavera, the new sharply contoured slender form and rippling sinuous line that is synonymous with Botticelli, was influenced by the brilliant, precise draftsmanship of the Palladio brothers, who trained not only as painters but as goldsmiths, engravers, sculptors, and embroidery designers. This is a pagan story and is depicted with reverent seriousness. Venus is the Virgin Mary in another form, but it's also significant that no one has ever agreed on the actual subject of Primavera, and the whole shelf in a library can be taken up on different theories as to, who's who. Scholars may argue we need no theories to make Primavera dear to us. In this allegory of life and beauty and knowledge, united by love, Botticelli catches the freshness of an early spring morning, with the pale light shining through the tall, straight trees, already laden with their golden fruit, oranges, and mythical golden apples. This painting was executed for the villa of Lorenzo de' Medici at Castello. The patron who commissioned the Botticelli painting for his country villa was a member of the rich and powerful family of the Medici. Either he himself or one of his learned friends probably explained to the painter what was known of the way the ancients had represented Venus rising from the sea. Scholars tell us the story of her birth as a symbol of mystery, through which the divine message of beauty came into the world. One can imagine that the painter set to work reverently to represent this myth in a worthy manner. The action of the picture is quickly understood. Venus has emerged from the sea on a shell, which is driven to the shore by a wind and flying wind gods amidst a shower of roses. Scholars tell the story of her birth as the symbol of mystery through which the divine message of beauty came to the world. One can imagine that the painter set to work reverently. Botticelli's Venus is so beautiful that we do not notice the unnatural length of her neck, the steep fall of her shoulders, and the odd way her left arm is hinged to her body. Botticelli took liberties with nature in order to achieve a graceful outline and to the beauty and harmony of the design, because they enhance the impression of an infinitely tender and delicate being wafting to the shore. And so there you have it. This is from 1485. Another artist that painted during this time was Giovanni Bellini. He was a Venetian painter, oh my goodness, founder of the Venetian School of Painting. Giovanni Bellini raised Venice to a center of Renaissance art that rivaled Florence and Rome. He brought to painting a new degree of realism, a new wealth of subject matter, and a new sensuousness in form and color. Giovanni Bellini was born in Venice. Little is known about his family, but yes. Here's another one of his paintings. This is called The Sacred Conversation. This is from 1490. Bellini's Sacred Conversation. We have the Madonna with Child and Saints Catherine and Magdalene. It's one of the loftiest expressions of this frequently painted theme. This painting shows a magisterial development that has prompted critics to recall the fundamental teachings of Leonardo Sfumato. So sfumato is where you have like a modeling or kind of a brown, like smoke-like, the way that if you look at the hands, like her hand around the baby, and you see how it's kind of dark brown and her fingers kind of have light and then sort of a brown that recedes back, that's called sfumato. It's a smoke-like. The light, in fact, softly progresses over the faces and garments, strikes from the side of the sort of figures of the Virgin and Saints Catherine and Magdalene, silent companions of the former in sacred contemplation. Also in characteristic symmetrical composition of all Bellini's sacred conversations, the spreading of this intimate light that tinges the figures is a demonstration of how far ahead Bellini was in those, in his paintings. So if we look at the Botticelli paintings and then we look at this Bellini painting, what we're seeing is that Botticelli's light was kind of equal everywhere. But with Bellini, we're really seeing it as if it were in a room that was lit like through the sun, like a window or a candle. So we call that a light source. So we have a definite light source rather than an all-over light. Okay. Also, the characteristic symmetrical composition of all Bellini's sacred conversations, the spreading of the light, all of these things make it suggest warm and yet a transparent depth. So it's really, really quite beautiful. This is another of a Bellini. This is the angel announcing the Virgin about the Annunciation. And so it's 2 panels. It covered the organ at the Santa Maria del Miracoli in Venice. And this is Andrea Mantegna. Andrea Mantegna was one of the foremost northern Italian painters in the 15th century, a master of perspective and foreshortening. He made important contributions to the compositional techniques of Renaissance painting. He was born probably in 1431, somewhere between Vicenza and Padua. He became the apprentice and adopted son of the painter Francesco Scarsioni of Padua. He developed a passionate interest in classical antiquity and the influence of both Roman sculpture and contemporary sculptor Donatello. Mantegna's rendering of the human form were distinguished for his solidly expressive and anatomical correctness, unlike some of the other artists. He was born, well, we already talked about that, so let's move on. And here we have Saints. This is another version. So this is one, he did this multiple times. So this is 1457. And this one is also in 1458, but you can see, totally different version of Saint Sebastian. And then he also, remember our oculus? So this was many times in different Renaissance buildings, painters would paint the ceiling and do frescoes on the ceiling. And this is another, case of that where he painted the old oculus. And so it's not really there, but then instead of just the sky, we have all the cherubim and, clouds and so forth looking over upon us and kind of standing inside the oculus. You'll see that if you go to the Pfister Hotel downtown and you look up or to the, I think the Riverside also has an oculus painted in the ceiling. Kind of interesting. And then this painting, which is probably one of the most beautiful paintings, I think, of Andrea Mantegna, and probably one of my favorites. The dating of this painting is debated. There are several assumptions ranging from the end of the Paduan period, from 1457 to around 1501. The most remarkable part of this painting is the perspective construction, whereby the image of the Redeemer appears to follow the spectator around the room through the use of an illusionistic technique. So no matter where you're kind of looking at it, it appears correct. It's very interesting. In a letter written on October 2nd in 1506, the Duke of Mantua, Lodovico Mantegna, mentioned a Christ in foreshortening among the works left by his father. It probably dates to 1570. In that case, it must have remained in Mantegna's studio for quite some time and may have been intended for his funeral. In fact, it was shown at the head of his catalog when he died. Subsequently, it was acquired by the Cardinal Gonzaga, and it entered the Brera in 1824. And I'm just going to end with a kind of longer look at this painting and just the delicateness and beauty of that foreshortening. It's really, really pretty amazing. All right, so next time we will continue to look at the High Renaissance, and I look forward to talking to you more about art.